Start with Don Sear. Dr. Don Sear is an associate professor of finance at Brock University. He teaches courses in corporate finance, international finance, and investments. Pretty well all these areas he's carried out research as well as consulted and provided specialized training for a number of organizations. Tony Shaw. Tony Shaw is in the Brock University Department of Geography, a fellow of CCOVI, and he teaches, of course, meteorology, applied climatology, etc., and has done quite a bit of research in the area of wine terroir, site selection, and most recently doing some work determining and evaluating sub-appellations for the Ontario VQA. So we'll start with Don Sear and then move on to Tony Shaw. Thanks. Don?
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming this afternoon. I'm going to start with a little video, given that we're going to be discussing weather today.
Every so often, the collective consciousness of our entire nation, from coast to coast to coast, is captured by a single solitary event. Unfortunately, it is often a terrible tragedy that brings us together. Last week in Canada, such a terrible tragedy occurred, a catastrophe that will affect the country for decades to come. There was snow on the streets of Toronto. Snow in Toronto. We're not making this up.
I remember it just like it was last week. I opened the door and looked out, and there it was. It was everywhere. I'm sorry. This is hard.
When I saw my Lexus in the driveway, it was covered. You could not see in, you could not see out. It finally hit home. Toronto had been a target. We had been hit by snow.
But what about the residents? How did they cope? Many didn't, but many defeated the odds, and they rose to the occasion.
I couldn't think of myself. There was no time. I thought of my child and how she needed to get to Montessori. I reached out with my hand and my isotoner glove, and I pushed the snow off the windshield. And I just got in the car. After that, I blacked out.
For many, it was just too much.
I always thought that this was the type of thing that happened to other people. But when I saw the snow, I started screaming. Where's the army? Where's the police? Why me? Why now? Why Toronto?
And when it was over, the horrifying numbers came in. 20 centimeters of snow on the streets of Toronto.
Snow in Toronto. A CBC National special report.
Well, the relationship that video has with respect to the discussion today is the managing of unexpected weather events. So weathering the storm versus your financial bottom line, hedging weather-related risks in the viticulture industry with weather contracts. My name is Don Sear. My fellow researchers in this area are Martin Kuzi in the Faculty of Business and Tony Shaw, who is also a CCOVI fellow from the Department of Geography. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about weather derivatives in general, what they are, a little bit of the history of them. We'll then move to the specific weather-related risks faced by the viticulture industry. And then I'm going to talk in turn about 4 different areas that we have looked at in terms of managing weather-related risks, potentially with weather derivatives. And then I'll end by talking about some of the current research we're involved in as well as some future issues. Weather derivatives are a relatively new financial security. They take the form of what is known as swaps, or more commonly options with payoffs contingent on a weather-related variable. Average temperature, heating and cooling degree days, maximum, minimum temperatures, also precipitation and frost, and in humidity and sunshine. Anywhere where we have a weather variable that we can measure relatively objectively, there are weather contracts or weather derivatives that are being written upon them and enabling the hedging of risks related to these variables. There's 5 essential elements to every weather derivative contract. You have to have the weather index or variable that you're interested in. Typically, you're looking at some period of time over which it accumulates, rainfall over the months of September and October, season or a month. You need a weather station that's reporting the weather variable, and something that usually is a government weather station because it has to be objectively observed by both parties. And then you have to determine some contract specifications. Something that we call the tick value refers to the dollar value for each move of the index that may be associated with the contract, the payout. And a reference, or what's called a strike price, the underlying index. When will the contract pay out under what conditions of the weather variable? Weather contracts have great potential in a wide variety of sectors in the economy. It's been estimated that 15% of the industrialized economy is weather sensitive. 20 to 30% of the gross domestic product of the U.S. is exposed to weather risk. And it's been estimated that the world's production output could increase by greater than 250 billion U.S. if weather risks were hedged effectively. They are different from insurance. So particularly in the agricultural area, we're used to agricultural insurance. Insurance contracts are generally intended to cover damages due to an infrequent high-loss event, hail damage. Moral hazard plays a significant role. That refers to the idea that you have to put forth a claim and provide proof of damage associated with the contract. Weather derivatives are more typically used in the case of limited loss, high probability events, such as simply adverse weather conditions. Didn't have enough sunshine over the growing season or enough rainfall. They're designed as a hedge on a weather variable. Again, the only requirement is some observable weather variable agreed by both parties, usually by an objective weather station. And in a lot of ways, they're more transparent than insurance contracts in the sense that both parties can observe the data by which the contract is typically priced. Interestingly enough, they first appeared in 1996, a contract between the now infamous Enron Corporation and Florida Power and Light. The growth, however, has been impressive. Since 1996, 1999, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange began trading standardized contracts. So they've grown from a $500 million size market in 1998 to $15 billion in 2008-09. This is a survey that's conducted by the Weather Risk Management Association, a relatively new association of end users and suppliers of these contracts. Most of the contracts are temperature related, and certainly in the organized exchange market, this is the energy industry, or participants in the energy industry that trade in them. However, it's forecasted to be a $200 billion market within 5 years. There are 2 types of contracts, the exchange-traded contract and the contracts that we're going to be talking about today, the over-the-counter market, or OTC contracts. The standardized contracts, they commenced trading in 1999 on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Major U.S., European, Asian, Canadian cities in 2006, and this past year Australian cities have contracts, temperature contracts now written on them, trading on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Most of these are written on what's called cooling degree days or heating degree days. The number of degrees below which the daily temperature, average daily temperature, was below 18 degrees Celsius or above it. And whether, of course, you needed to heat your house, or to cool it down, and the energy involved, of course, and the possibility of energy revenues is traded on this basis. Usually it's cumulative, monthly, or even over a season. In recent years, there are contracts written now on snowfall. Started with New York and Boston. Last year, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange introduced contracts written on Chicago, Minneapolis, and Detroit, and also on frost in a number of cities. The contracts we're going to talk about, though, and which we are examining, are contracts that would be written in what's called the over-the-counter market. So this is a private sale and purchase of a contract, privately negotiated between two parties. And these allow for the hedging of non-standardized situations and risks. You can specialize the terms of the contract relating to the specific needs, and also the location, to some extent, of the variable measured. Of course, the liquidity is not as great. It's not a contract that has a organized exchange in which it can be bought and sold, but that's typically not the use of these contracts either. And the price must be agreed upon by the two parties. And much of our research looks at the pricing of these contracts and their potential use. The over-the-counter market has seen very substantial growth over the past 5 or 6 years. Much of that growth has occurred in contracts written not on temperature, but on precipitation. The growth has largely taken place due to the availability now of contracts readily. So there are a number of firms that are specializing in these weather contracts. Weatherbill is a quite famous one now, Guaranteed Weather, Evo Markets, and several others. And as well, many insurance firms, realizing the potential size of this market, now stand ready to write contracts for very specialized weather-related risks. Some examples of contracts that have been written in the over-the-counter market are listed here. I'll just point out a few of these, particularly ones perhaps not related to agriculture, which is what we're going to be talking about. But for example, an Atlanta hair salon in 2006 started hedging its revenues using weather contracts. The hair salon owner found that on rainy weekends, customers tended to go to the movie theater, which was attached to the mall that the hair salon was in. And on sunny weekends, revenues dropped off. They didn't come out of the theater and get their hair done. So he buys weather contracts that hedge against low rainfall on weekends. He buys these from a firm called Weatherbill. 2006, the United Nations World Food Program bought an $8 million option contract on rainfall in Ethiopia, measured over several different spots. The idea here that if they have drought conditions over the growing season, they know they're going to be into a famine situation, and intervention will have to take place, costly, and so hedging the costs of that intervention. So nonprofits have been finding them to be of value. The Canadian travel agency iTravel 2000 got a lot of attention for its marketing program, whereby if it snowed more than 5 inches on January 1st, you had your travel paid for, covered the cost of. They hedge their cost using weather contracts that they purchase from Weatherbill. Finally, just this past year, the City of Victoria, BC, has a marketing program called Sunshine Guarantee, where if you book your stay in Victoria through the tourism agency and it rains on the day you're in Victoria, you get your hotel for free. They hedge their these potentially lost revenues using weather contracts based upon rainfall. So you can see a wide variety of different applications, potential applications in many different sectors of the economy. That being the case, these contracts are still relatively unknown, and interestingly enough, very more so in the agriculture sector. 2009, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange did a survey of senior managers, U.S. and Canadian firms. They found that 82% believe global climate change will impact their business. 51% do not believe their firms deal effectively with current weather risks. 10% indicated that they have attempted to hedge weather, only 10%. Of the 10% that have, 86% of those have found the contracts or hedging to be useful. In the agriculture sector, 94% of the respondents were moderately to extremely concerned about weather risks, and 60% were concerned about increased weather variability due to climate change. But only 25% have attempted to even quantify the weather-related risks to their business, and only 8% have attempted to hedge weather-related risks. So there's still some information and value with regards to weather derivatives, which is weather contracts, which is not out there. So viticulture, which is the focus of our studies, faces a myriad of risk factors. Throughout the year, of course, excessive cold during the winter season can result in winter injury, frost or heavy rains in springtime, excessive heat in our region, or cool, rainy conditions, either side can be a risk. And then finally, heavy rain at the time of harvest can significantly reduce the revenues to a grape grower. We've looked at 4 different areas in terms of the potential use of weather derivatives. And our research started with Canadian ice wine production, a paper that looked at the potential use of these contracts. So I'm going to talk about each of these studies in turn and draw some conclusions about each of them, and in general, what our findings are as well. Our first study attracted a bit of attention from the industry. A couple of articles in Wine Business Monthly looking at the potential use of them, but also the lack of awareness or use in the industry. And also the Globe and Mail picked up on our research alongside with iTravel 2000, the travel agency, which that year had also engaged in the use of weather derivatives. So let's take a look at ice wine. And what we did in this study is we said, let's define an ice wine production hour as the number of hours when the temperature is between -8, below which we know that the harvesting of the grapes could take place, and -12. Although some producers have the ability to harvest the ice wine grapes below -12, it's dependent somewhat upon your ability to do so. So we look at the -8 to -12 zone as the common zone at which ice wine grapes would be harvested. And here we have a graph from 1965 to 2005-06 showing the daily average number of hours during which the temperature was between -8 and -12. And as you can see, it builds up here. And, January, we have some days when we could get 4 hours or so, or even more, up to 5. And then it starts declining by February. Many producers, anecdotally, we've been told, would like to have about 70 hours where the temperature was in the zone of -8 to -12, perhaps with some not constantly in there, but in and out, and believe that increases the quality of the ice wine. And so we used 70 hours as a basic contract idea. And you can see that November, December, and January, if by the beginning of February you have not had the number of ice wine hours that you'd like to have seen, you're probably experiencing some deterioration in terms of the crop. It's been warm, so you'll probably have disease and some decay, and as well predators, birds in the field. So one area in terms of weather derivatives that is an issue is what do you do when you want to price these contracts? How do you define the weather variable, and what is the statistical process that can characterize this weather variable. So there's a number of studies around this issue. In general, they conclude that you have several choices. You could look at daily temperatures and model your variable. You could do a number of transformations. But it seems that the thing to do with the least amount of error is to examine the variable that is of most interest to you. So if that is the cumulative number of ice wine production hours between November and January, you want to look at that as a variable and look at its stochastic process over time. It is a transformation of other daily variable, but if you attempt to model that, they find that the errors accumulate and you don't have as good a result. So that's what we did. We looked at the cumulative number of ice wine hours from November through January over that 41-year period. The average is 176 hours from November through to the end of January. However, there is some risk associated with it. It has a relatively high standard deviation. The distribution of those hours is given here, and you can see that it is sort of skewed. It's not exactly symmetric. So this is a plot of the cumulative number of ice wine production hours from 1965-66 on to 2006. And again, this shows the variability in that from year to year. So we do have a fair amount of variance, although we are a region that is able to consistently produce ice wine. We do have some variability in there. And we looked at this data using statistical and econometric techniques, fairly sophisticated ones. And what we found is that this weather variable can be characterized as something that comes from what is called a normal distribution, but there are jumps or spikes or outliers in it. You can see two of them here, two of them identified, that are outside the norm and the range statistically of the data. It's interesting to note that these spikes were in terms of extremely cold seasons. These high values indicate there were quite a number of hours of ice wine production available. You can see that at 346, over double, close to double the average. And it's this variability that causes the risk. So every year, whether or not between November and the end of January, are there going to be enough hours? Are you going to have a good crop? And if it gets into February, it's unlikely that the ice wine hours may be there, and associated with that as well, decay and loss of crop. So then we looked at, well, let's design a contract that could be used to hedge ice wine production, and we'll take a look at pricing that. Pricing these contracts is an issue. This is just some list of references about the debate. It is not something that we're going to get into today, but it does relate to how much am I, as a producer, willing to pay for a weather contract to hedge my risk. If these contracts were written on what we call a traded asset, something that we could see the price of every day, that would be different, and we could use with certainty the risk-neutral valuation approaches. But that's what we're going to use here. And in the industry, that approach, or what are called the actuarial approaches, are typical for pricing these securities. So here's a what we call a put option. And the put option is designed so that if the cumulative number of ice wine hours falls below a set amount, which is called the strike value, which you set as part of the contract as a producer, then the option pays off at the end of the season. So if you don't have the number of ice wine hours you'd like to see, this contract is going to pay out. And it's going to pay out, and again, this is a choice based upon the producer's specific operations. We use $2,000 per ice wine hour just as a benchmark figure. All of these numbers can be changed, of course, however, and we can design the contract to what fits our specific needs. This table shows you the payouts that would have occurred under different strike values. So if I said that I wanted to be sure that I had at least 70 hours or I was paid out by the contract at the end of the season, then you can see over the years the number of years when there would have been a payout here. And in 2001-02, we would have had a payout of $62,000 from the contract. Roughly, the price of the contract seems to be about $1,570, so that's what you could expect to be roughly a fair price to pay per year to enter into a contract that's going to pay you $2,000 for every ice wine hour that doesn't occur below 70. And if we increase the strike price, of course, to something like 170, which is just about the average number of ice wine hours we expect over that time period, you can see that the payouts increase quite a bit. And just about every few years, well, roughly half of the 41 years, there will be a payout equal to the amount of the number of ice wine hours over and above 170 times $2,000 per ice wine hour. But the amount that you're going to pay for that contract per year might be relatively high. Our research looks at the idea that the stochastic process associated, the behavior of this weather variable seems to be one where it's fairly normal, but there are jumps, outliers. And this is called a mixed normal and Poisson jump process. And so using that, we're then able to model, using simulation, what the different payouts would be, and under, again, this idea of fair pricing or risk-neutral valuation, what you might expect to pay for these contracts. And you can see some differences between the prices depending upon the assumptions for the weather variable. But in general, the ballpark figures are roughly there. So this is a contract that protects you against having not enough or a suboptimal level of ice wine production hours in a season. We then took a look at hedging, was referred to as bioclimatic risk. And there are a number of indices that look at the suitability of the climate over time with respect to viticulture. Two very important ones and long-standing ones are the Winkler and Uglin indices, and they are defined here, and you can see that they use a combination of the minimum and maximum temperatures during the day. And so basically what they're capturing is that between the period of April through September, they're looking at the amount of heat in the growing season that would have occurred. Our region, the Niagara region, in terms of the Winkler index, falls in approximately the 1,200 to 1,300 growing degree days. This is the measure of this index. And the Uglin index falls in the 1,500 to 1,800, and that gives us the class of temperate cool, or that's our region. And then the Winkler also has a similar categorization of regions, of which we're into region 2. So we looked at the behavior of the cumulative Uglin and Winkler indices for the Niagara region from the period 1965-2007. Here's a graph of the two indices. A couple of things to note. We note some increased volatility. If I take a look after roughly the late 80s, early 90s, I can sort of see some increased volatility here in the Uglin index, also in the Winkler index. And as I proceed through our studies, I'll point this out to you again. And we believe that it is indicative of climate change that is occurring. And climate change researchers suggest, particularly two studies, one out of Purdue and one out of Colorado, that in the northern hemisphere, with climate change, what we can expect to see is increased volatility. And it's this increased volatility and risk which makes these weather contracts all the more important, or potential of them for hedging. And you can certainly see that in the data in terms of these basically heat indices that over the growing season for our region. The basic summary statistics are given there for the Winkler and the Yukon Index, as well as the distributions of them. And you can see that, again, they are skewed. There's not a normal distribution there. And we test them, of course, for some advanced statistical processes, much as a finance researcher, much as I might do with stock returns. I look at their behavior using econometric techniques. And what we find is, again, interesting. We note the presence of these statistical presence of these jumps or outliers that occur. And also, in terms of the Winkler Index, a level shift, a statistically significant level shift. Our region has gotten a bit warmer over the past 10 years or so, and you can see that level shift here. But also increased volatility, these increased outliers associated with the index. The Yukon Index, same idea. We don't see the shift, although we might imagine there is one there, but it's not statistically significant. But again, we're getting increased volatility, and that was picked up by the presence of these time series outliers in the data. And again, we believe that that's indicative of the impact of climate change. We designed a contract here that said a producer perhaps growing a portfolio of grapes, perhaps white and red, might be interested in hedging against very low or cool temperatures over the summer, and also very hot ones. If temperatures are cool, whites might do well, reds might not. If it's very hot, reds might do well, our whites might not. And we could imagine that we would have some loss of potential revenues in either case. So we designed a contract called the short condor contract. It looks like this. It says that if the index, the Yukon Index, falls below 1,500, then we start receiving some payout from the contract. And that continues. And we put a cap on the contract to show, which is frequently the case in these weather derivatives. There's oftentimes a cap to reflect perhaps maximum losses that we are willing to hedge against. And if the Yukon Index is above 1,800, again, the contract pays out with a cap of $2 million. Again, we price then using, in here, the burn rate analysis, which is the typical insurance approach that says, let's historically look back at what would have happened with this contract, how often would it have paid out, how much would it have paid out, and given the index values over time, we have the different payouts, and you can see, of course, that it's paying out more frequently in these later years of study. And of course, that reflects the increased volatility that is taking place in our weather over the growing season in the Niagara region. We then, recognizing that the statistical process that seems to match this data is this Jump Diffusion process, we then use Monte Carlo simulation to model this and to, again, look at different contract specifications. I don't have to hedge for 1,800 and 1,500. I could hedge for something a little less drastic, and I'll pay a little less in terms of the contract per year. So these are our estimated prices using Monte Carlo simulation. That took us to the next study, and that was with respect to harvest rainfall. Harvest rainfall is a significant risk in the viticulture industry. You can have a great growing season, and then in September and October comes time for the harvest, and if there are significant rains and the grapes take up a lot of water, the Brix levels can drop dramatically, and you can see prices drop quite quickly as well. And So this is a significant risk over a relatively short time period of, on the outside, a 2-month period. And again, we're using this as an example, but the length of time can be picked by any producer. If they say that September to October, to the end of October is a little too broad a range, they can shorten that and pick whatever dates they want to in the over-the-counter market. The contract specifications can be made unique to the producer's need. Of course, high rainfall also results in splitting of the grapes and their susceptibility to disease as well. So again, we looked at rainfall, cumulative rainfall through September and October 1965 on through 2007. We found some outliers earlier on. Again, the data statistically fit a process best described as a mixed jump diffusion process, a normal distribution with every now and then outliers. And although statistically we didn't test specifically for variance after 1990, you can see that there appears to be some increase in terms of the volatility around cumulative rainfall over the harvest season as well. And again, we believe that is consistent with the findings with respect to climate change. The burn rate analysis says you can pick your strike value, how many millimeters of rain do you wish to hedge against. In this case, the contract is a call option that pays out the higher is the cumulative rainfall over the September and October period. If you pick 150, you're going to have payouts roughly half the time, and the contract will cost you a lot. If you pick something less as the strike value, the point at which above in rainfall the contract will pay out, you'll get less payouts, of course, and the contract will cost you less. So again, I'm emphasizing the idea that in that over-the-counter market, which is now readily available, you can specify these contracts to meet your needs. Again, we looked at the prices using the Jump Diffusion process, and here we have a wider range of them based upon the assumptions that might go into what the stochastic process is. I think in many cases, when I look at these benchmark figures, I think that except if I want to hedge very extensively at smaller amounts of hedging or degrees of hedging, I'm seeing values do not seem unreasonable in terms of most organizations. Finally, our last study has been on winter injury, which is, of course, very significant in our area, occurring over the periods of November through March. Extreme minimum temperatures can result in very significant winter injury and damage to the crop. Trunk splitting, of course. It's been estimated that 5 to 10% of the world grape production is lost due to winter injury each year. The winters of 2003 and 2004 in the Niagara region resulted in a 2005 crop of only half that of 2002. So 2 winters that were very significant. You could see the impact of this. The loss of one grapevine, when you consider that it takes at least a minimum of 3 years before a productive crop is taken off from a replanted or new grapevine, the cost is roughly $150 to $170 for every grapevine lost in terms of present value. So using numbers like that, we looked at a 40-acre vineyard in the Niagara region, and in a period of severe winter injury could lose up to $700,000 in a year due to the loss of vines and general reduction in the crop. So we define cumulative winter degree days as the cumulative number of degrees below minus 15 degrees Celsius that the daily minimum temperature achieves over the months of November through March. This is very similar to what's known as heating degree days in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange standardized exchange contracts traded in the energy industry. Very similar construction over, instead of looking at the number of degrees, the minimum temperature is below 18 degrees Celsius, we're looking at the cumulative number below minus 15. And we take a look at that number over 43 years. On average, it's 27 degrees over those months. The distribution of it is quite skewed. And again, when we examine it, we notice some interesting things. Statistically, again, we ended up with a jump diffusion process, which seemed to best characterize the data. We also noted a level shift downwards in terms of, from 1998, 97 onwards, statistically, in terms of the number, even though we did experience some cold years, relatively speaking, they're not as bad as we had seen in some previous years, but perhaps before significant grape growing of Vitis vinifera was being carried on in the Niagara region. So it might not have been something that was noted particularly. Here we designed a collar, what is known as a collar. It's like having a call option with a cap on it that says we're going to cap the payout at $700,000 as representing what we think to be a maximum loss that we might experience, and associate it roughly with about 40 winter injury degree days as we define, cumulative winter injury degree days. So pricing this contract again, depending on the strike level, at which point in cumulative winter degree days do we want the contract to pay out so that we can hedge. We can specify that. We again looked at various distributional assumptions with regards to the data, but our data appears to exhibit the mixed jump diffusion process, and here you see the prices that were estimated using Monte Carlo simulation. This is a significantly costly contract, but the cost of winter injury is high, and so you're hedging significant revenues to the producer. Some future research. This whole area of research and the examination of weather variables from an econometric and financial standpoint, and the pricing of contracts, financial contracts based upon them, led us into the area of the mixed jump diffusion process. And there's still some research to go on there. Estimating the jump parameters from the overall data is an issue that's not been completely resolved. We use a very standardized approach to carry out our Monte Carlo simulations, but different approaches will change the prices in these contracts, but we don't believe to be significantly so, but we know that this is an area that will be changing. Right now we're carrying out some research on combining these variables together, all of these weather variables, and defining a hedging contract that would be overall for the industry. We imagine that there's a fair amount of correlation between these weather variables, which when used in a combined sense could reduce the cost of hedging overall for grape producers in the area. And so this is something that we're currently taking a look at. We're also looking at the optimal methods of determining an appropriate contract terms in order to minimize basis risk. There is what's called basis risk with these contracts. The idea that the weather station that I pick that I have to pick in order to have this contract might be a government weather station, and it might be relatively near to my vineyard, or it might not be. And weather, as we know, varies geographically. And I might have heavy rainfall in my vineyard and perhaps not at the meteorological site. This is an issue, and it's called basis risk. It's not uncommon in some other financial contracts. There are methods of dealing with that and designing and choosing the optimal hedging strategy given this increased risk that exists due to the disconnect between the variable measured in your own vineyard versus that at the meteorological site. I think in general we find the work on weather derivatives to be fascinating. They have a lot of applications, potential applications for many sectors. We think the wine industry, the viticulture industry, could benefit greatly from the use of weather derivatives for hedging many of the weather-related risks that they face. And climate change research seems to suggest that weather-related risks will increase in the future, the increase in volatility, and that's exactly what these contracts are designed to provide protection from. And that's the end. I'll just repeat your question, Michael, for those that are online. The question is, how do the contract premiums vary for these contracts versus other financial contracts? That we're not entirely sure of in the over-the-counter market. In that over-the-counter market, of course, you would expect that there is in a sense, a fee, a commission to the writer of the contract. In other over-the-counter markets, that might be 20% of the overall contract size. The increasing presence of firms that are specializing in these weather derivatives, of course, results in competition that brings that commission price down. The question is, are there any growers in the Niagara region using these contracts right now? Not that we know of, although this coming summer, some of our research is going to be a survey of growers in the area, their awareness of these contracts and their potential use and whether they are using them. I would suspect not, just from the lack of use in agriculture in general, and although in 2008 we did get some attention from the wine press with regards to them, I'm not aware of any. In California, possibly. We did have discussions with a larger corporation down there and their potential use in hedging their vineyards in Northern California as well as Oregon. They did not enter into contracts at that time because they did not have many of their vineyards they had not owned for all that long, and so they were not sure of the weather history around to use. But we do know that in the case of, for example, some of the firms that are writing these contracts, that there are agents that are dealing specifically with the wine industry in California.
A warm year. Is there any way you can make that asymmetrical?
Yeah, the question is with regards to our study of the bioclimatic indices, the Winkler and the Uglin index. The contract that we specified the short Condor contract, had caps on it of $2 million in the payout. And it's pointed out that it's unlikely that a grower in this region would want to hedge or need to hedge, particularly the higher temperatures associated over the growing season. And yes, that's entirely possible. In fact, the structure of this payout could have been simply hedging against the cool climate. It would have been the reverse collar of the contract that we used in terms of winter injury, a reversed structure. So there's a lot of flexibilities in these things in terms of what you want to have as caps, whether you want to have payouts on either side or not. The nature of the payout. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, in their snowfall contracts that they've recently introduced in 2009, are what are called binary contracts. So there the contract is one that says if it snows, if the cumulative snowfall is greater than a certain amount for which I wish to hedge against, I don't want to have a payout that increases linearly with the amount of snowfall over and above the strike. I want to just get paid a fixed amount. And that's because if I'm in the business of snowfall removal and I have some contracts and the snowfall is higher than what I expected, I'm going to have to go out and lease additional equipment at a certain point, and there is a fixed jump to my costs. And so those contracts are called binary contracts in the sense that as opposed to having this linear payout, once the index is above a certain level, it just simply pays out. Not something that we'd want to use here, of course, but just as an indication of the flexibility by which you can get contracts, even contracts that are trading on exchanges. And just to repeat the question for those online, the question relates to how much knowledge does a producer have to have in order to be willing to enter into these contracts or get involved with them. And that is a potential issue in terms of their lack of use in particular sectors. These are relatively new, and although there are elements of these contracts that relate to much older financial contracts, options and swaps, they are relatively new, and the idea of them being tied to weather is an issue. The agriculture industry, though, when we take a look at its use of futures contracts, seems to be readily able to enter into more sophisticated markets with time, once the awareness increases. But I think at this point in time, I think that is definitely an issue, and perhaps something that is mitigating their widespread adoption, not just in agriculture, but a lot of other sectors too. It is interesting that the retail side, or at least some of the anecdotal examples of contracts we're seeing, are oftentimes tied in with tourism and events, as opposed to specifically agriculture, right now.